General Yeti's time has expired. With that, we go to questions for from the committee. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question is to Dr. Taylor Calais. I sit on the China Select Committee, and we've heard testimony from our generals and done tabletop exercises that demonstrate that the United States lacks the stockpiles of critical munitions for a military engagement with the PRC over Taiwan. Doctor, looking at the current defense stockpiles and considering the capacity and production rates of our defense industrial base, from your perspective, do you believe we are adequately positioned to meet and defeat the global threats facing the United States and our allies, including the current wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, as well as a potential conflict involving China?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. First, I want to state off the bat again that the Department of Defense uses the DPA to increase the readiness and resilience of our industrial base, specifically to address the threats that you mentioned in support of national defense. I think it's important to note that we learned a lot over the last few years after COVID and Ukraine and what we've had to do to mobilize the industrial base. But our industrial base has managed to keep us safe and provided warfighters tools and capabilities to fight our adversaries in times of need. I think that we view the importance of having surge capacity and more resilience in the industrial base is very important, and we intend to continue to use the Defense Production Act.
Do you think we're ready? That's the question. And here's a good example. In the paper yesterday, one of the national papers is talking about China's satellite fleet poses threats to U.S. troops in potential Pacific conflict, and this comes from the Space Force Intelligence Chief. They've got 200 more satellites in space today than it did just a few years ago, and their capacity has increased 550%. That's a real threat. Are we ready to address that? That's the question.
Sir, the PRC remains our pacing threat, and certainly Taiwan being the pacing scenario. The way that we use the Defense Production Act is really to address a lot of the pain points in the supply chain for critical technologies and capabilities that we need in order to meet the threat.
Okay, follow-up question then. Because we sometimes misuse the DPA, does that pose a danger for these industries, these different companies, whenever they have to then turn their company around and actually respond to a national security threat? You understand my question?
Absolutely,
do they have
sir.
the capacity to do two things at one time? I guess that's the question. And do they have the ability to prioritize away from the one that is not necessarily a national security issue to the one where our lives are hanging in the balance?
And sir, I would offer that part of the way that we use the Title I authorities is to exactly address this issue. So the prioritization of defense critical needs is one that we work within the department and with the Department of Commerce to do so that the industrial resources that we need, the critical components that we need for our key systems, for our weapons, are available at the time that we need them. Okay,
Ms. Spisak, you talked a while ago about different ways that you interact with all these different agencies and deliver services. So from that standpoint, can you help me see how we can be more targeted with the DPA? Because to make sure we do it the right way, that we don't have extraneous things that we're doing with it that are necessarily national security oriented, but we can target where we need to go. Is there a way to do that?
Chairman, thank you for your question. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, and several of us have alluded to the evolving threat landscape, is trying to balance the authorities within the Defense Production Act with the checks and balances associated with the program administration. And so by continuing to offer that flexibility up front, it allows us to meet those growing needs, but also make sure that we are paying attention to those checks and balances and evaluating the work.
Dr. Calais again, there's one of our industries back home. I guess you kind of have to, we go back to help me understand the process here of how an industry or an individual company can access the system, because apparently what goes on is you'll send out a request for proposal, they'll send you their information, but they never heard from again. Defense Department doesn't respond in a timely fashion and say, hey, we didn't ask you for something for this particular piece of military equipment or hardware. Where we were looking for something else. instead they get something back and say, well, there's no funds available, or they don't answer at all. Can you talk to that issue?
Absolutely, sir. So first and foremost, there are a couple of different ways to submit white papers into the Department of Defense. We have the newly stood up Defense Industrial Base Consortium, OTA. But I will note that it has been my priority as Assistant Secretary to speed up our execution times, including our response to industry.
Okay, what we may do is send you a question and ask for a written response on that, because we've got some specific examples of people who are not being responded to. Thank you very much, and I'll yield back. With that, we could recognize the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.